A millionaire gave his unlimited credit card to a homeless woman. Hours later, he broke down in tears. Arthur had always been a successful man. From a young age, he knew what he wanted and worked tirelessly to secure his place in the business world. By his early 30s, he had become one of the richest men in his city, surrounded by luxury, comfort, and prestige. However, something always seemed to be missing inside him. He had everything money could buy, but deep down, he felt a growing emptiness that none of his material possessions could fill. One ordinary day after a business meeting, Arthur decided to walk through a neighborhood far from the city center. The place was completely different from the luxurious area where he lived. The narrow, dirty streets were filled with people facing realities far from his own. He always avoided such encounters, finding it uncomfortable to face people living in misery. However, that day, something made him keep walking. That's when he saw her. Sitting on the sidewalk with torn clothes and disheveled hair, a woman in her early 30s was staring intently at the ground. As he passed by, Arthur felt a strange sense of familiarity. There was something in her features that made him stop. He walked back a few steps and, with some hesitation, knelt down beside her. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Are you okay?" The woman slowly lifted her eyes, revealing a face that took his breath away. It was Julia, his childhood friend, someone with whom he had shared so many moments. They had been inseparable as kids, but life had drifted them apart. Arthur pursued his career and dreams of grandeur, while Julia had vanished from his life without a trace. Julia? He could barely utter her name, so great was his surprise. She looked at him with tired eyes but said nothing. The silence was heavy, filled with untold stories. Arthur didn't know what to say, but a flood of memories overwhelmed him. Promises to look out for each other, plans for the future, and a desire to never be separated. All of that seemed so distant now, like it belonged to another life. Julia, in turn, just observed him. She knew who he was, but pride kept her from asking for help. She had faced years of hardships, going through situations Arthur could never imagine. And now, seeing him there, in an expensive suit with an impeccable appearance, only highlighted the distance between their realities. But at the same time, something in his eyes made her believe he didn't see her just as another homeless person. He seemed genuinely concerned. Arthur, unsure of how to act, followed his instinct. He pulled out his wallet and, without thinking twice, handed her his credit card. "Here, buy whatever you need. I trust you." The gesture was so unexpected that Julia could hardly react. She looked at the card, then at Arthur, and a mix of emotions overwhelmed her. She felt gratitude but also shame. Money was not what she wanted, and certainly not charity. However, for a brief moment, she realized this might be the only genuine act of kindness she would receive in a long time. Without saying a word, she took the card, and Arthur stood up, still stunned by what he had just done. He knew there was something deeper in that situation, but he couldn't fully understand it. In any case, he felt compelled to help his old friend, even without exactly knowing how. As Julia disappeared into the bustling streets, Arthur stood there for a few minutes, reflecting on the encounter. What had happened to her? How had she ended up in that situation? And why did he feel so responsible for it? These questions began to haunt him, bringing up feelings of guilt and regret he didn't know he had. This was the first step in Arthur's journey of redemption, a journey that would lead him to confront not only his past, but also to realize that his true wealth lay not in the money he had accumulated, but in the connections he had lost along the way. He didn't know it yet, but that meeting with Julia would be the beginning of a profound and irreversible transformation in his life. Arthur returned home that night with a restlessness that kept him from sleeping. He couldn't get Julia out of his mind. The memories of his childhood resurfaced with a force he hadn't expected. He remembered the afternoons they ran through fields, the secrets shared, the promises of eternal friendship. Julia had been his confidant, his best friend. And now, seeing her in that situation was deeply disturbing to him. While lying in the luxurious bed of his apartment, surrounded by everything money could buy, Arthur felt a disconnect. Despite the wealth he had accumulated over the years, he now realized he had lost something far more valuable: the people who truly mattered. Julia was a living reminder of that. He wondered how her life had taken that turn, and why, with all his resources, he had never tried to find her. In the morning, still shaken by the encounter, Arthur tried to distract himself with work. His schedule was packed, as usual, and the responsibilities kept pressing on him. However, amid the meetings and phone calls, the image of Julia wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to focus on business, but the emptiness he felt was more evident than ever. Arthur couldn't understand why, but he knew that somehow the encounter hadn't been a mere coincidence. As the hours passed, he began to wonder what Julia might have done with the credit card. He didn't expect her to abuse his generosity, but at the same time, he wondered how someone living in such conditions would handle something so valuable. Determined to find out, he checked the account linked to the card. What he saw surprised him. Julia had used the card only once to buy a simple meal at a small local restaurant. Nothing more. Arthur was stunned by this revelation. He had expected her to buy clothes, food for several days, or even something luxurious, but no. Julia had opted for something so basic, something he took for granted every day. This gesture touched Arthur deeply. He realized that Julia didn't want his charity or the luxury the card could provide. She was seeking something much more essential: dignity. This made him reevaluate his role in the situation. He had offered the card as an easy solution, but it was clear that Julia needed something beyond money. She needed an opportunity. This realization began to change the way Arthur viewed his own wealth. For years, he had accumulated money and possessions, believing they would bring him happiness and security. But at that moment, he understood that his true wealth lay in what he could do for others. The simple fact that Julia had used the card in such a humble manner showed him that it wasn't the financial value that mattered, but the human value. With this in mind, Arthur decided he couldn't leave things as they were. He knew he needed to do more for Julia, not out of guilt, but because something inside him urged him to. He didn't just want to help her survive. He wanted to help her reclaim the life they had once dreamed of having. A life of dignity, fulfillment, and possibilities. Determined to make a difference, Arthur began to think of ways to truly impact Julia's life. He had resources, contacts, influence, everything needed to change her reality. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't do it alone. Julia would need to accept the help. She would need to be willing to rise again, and that was something only she could decide. As he reflected on this, Arthur realized that this wasn't just about rescuing a friend from the past. It was an opportunity for him to find a greater purpose in his own life. He had always believed that material success would fulfill him, but now it was clear that true success came from something much deeper. It came from the impact he could have on the lives of the people around him. That night, Arthur returned to the neighborhood where he had found Julia. He didn't know if he would find her, but he had to try. He knew that somehow that encounter had been the first step towards something greater for both Julia and himself. When he arrived at the narrow, dark streets, he felt a growing anxiety. What if she didn't want his help? What if she rejected him again? After searching for a few hours, Arthur finally spotted Julia in a corner, under a canopy. She was eating what seemed to be the same simple meal she had bought earlier. Arthur approached slowly, unsure of how to start the conversation. "Julia?" he called softly, hoping not to startle her. She looked at him with the same tired eyes as before, but now there was a hint of curiosity in her expression. "I saw what you did," Arthur continued, trying to find the right words. "And I want to help for real, not with money, but with something that can give you back the dignity you deserve." Julia stayed silent for a moment. She knew accepting help was a hard step, but something in Arthur's eyes, in the tone of his voice, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the opportunity she had been waiting for all along. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. She just wanted a chance to start over. And with that feeling, she finally responded, "I just want an opportunity." Arthur smiled. He knew that this was the moment to take the next step. The transformation he sought for himself was tied to the transformation he could bring to Julia. And together, they would start down a path of redemption and rebuilding. With Julia's response echoing in his mind, "I just want an opportunity," Arthur felt a mix of relief and responsibility. He knew this simple request carried a huge weight. Julia wasn't asking for a handout or expecting him to solve all her problems. She wanted dignity, and that required more than charity. It required a plan, a concrete action that would allow her to take control of her life. On the way back home, Arthur began to think about how he could offer Julia this opportunity. He had the financial resources, but he knew money alone wasn't the complete solution. She needed support, guidance, and above all, a safe space where she could restart. This would require more than an isolated gesture. It would need continuous effort and probably creating something bigger than he had ever imagined. In the following days, Arthur dedicated himself to planning a rehabilitation and training program for homeless people. The idea came from a mix of his desire to help Julia and a deeper reflection on the role he, with his wealth and influence, could play in society. For years, he had focused only on expanding his business and increasing his fortune, but now he saw a new opportunity before him, to use these resources to create a positive impact in the world. He hired social work experts and psychologists to help him structure the program. The idea was to create an environment where people like Julia could not only have their basic needs met, but also receive training, education, and eventually employment. Arthur knew he couldn't do this alone, so he reached out to some of his most influential contacts to discuss the idea and seek support. The project gained momentum quickly. Many business people and philanthropists were impressed with Arthur's proposal and were willing to help. However, for him, the most important thing was to ensure that Julia would be the first beneficiary of this new program. He wanted her to be the symbol of hope and transformation, a proof that with the right opportunity, anyone could rise again. After weeks of planning and preparation, Arthur was ready to present the project to Julia. He found her again in the same neighborhood, sitting under the awning. This time, he felt a different kind of confidence. He wasn't there just to offer a gesture of kindness, but a solution that could change her life. "Julia," he began with a gentle smile, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I want to give you more than just financial help. I want to give you a real opportunity to start over. I've created a program to help people in your situation, and you can be the first to take part in it." Julia listened carefully, but her eyes showed a mix of skepticism and hope. She had learned through years of disappointments not to believe in easy promises. However, something in Arthur's voice, in the way he spoke, made her want to trust. Still, she hesitated. "What if I can't make it?" Julia asked in a low voice. "I've tried so many times to start over, but I always end up failing." Arthur moved closer and put his hand on her shoulder. "It's not about failing or not," he said. "What matters is that you try. And this time, you won't be alone. I'll be by your side, and many others will be willing to support you. Life has knocked you down many times, but I believe that with the right opportunity, you can get up and build something new." Julia looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope ignite within her. She knew it would be a tough journey, but the fact that Arthur believed in her, that he was willing to invest time and resources in her recovery, made her allow herself to dream again. With a slight nod, Julia accepted Arthur's offer. This was the first step of her transformation, not just as a person, but as someone who would finally have the chance to rewrite her story. Arthur led her to the place where the program would be implemented. It was a large, well-equipped space with training rooms, rest areas, and professionals ready to help. Seeing that place, Julia was moved. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined she would have access to something like this. The first days were challenging for Julia. She had to face her own fears, insecurities, and traumas. However, with the support of the team and Arthur's constant presence, she began to take small but significant steps toward her recovery. Each new skill she learned, each small achievement, made her feel like she was finally on the right path. At the same time, Arthur was also undergoing his own transformation. Seeing Julia's progress, he began to realize that his true happiness wasn't in his material possessions, but in the human connections he had neglected for so long. He felt fulfilled in a way he had never experienced before. Helping Julia not only filled the void in his life, but also gave him a new purpose. Julia, in turn, was starting to regain her self-esteem and dignity. Arthur's program was bearing fruit, not just for her but for many others who were also participating. Over time, she became an inspiration to others, proving that with determination and support, it was possible to overcome even the toughest obstacles. However, the path wouldn't be easy, and they both knew it. There were still many challenges ahead, both for Julia and Arthur. But for the first time in years, they were both willing to face these challenges head-on, confident that together they could transform not only their own lives, but also the lives of many others. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Write friends in the comments. Only those who get this far will understand. And now let's continue with the story. Despite the initial progress, both Julia and Arthur soon realized that the journey of transformation would be much harder than they had imagined. The first weeks were marked by a mix of advances and setbacks, both for her and for Arthur himself, who found himself confronted with his own limitations and insecurities. For Julia, the path wasn't easy. Despite the welcoming environment and the support offered by the rehabilitation program, the ghosts of her past haunted her. Years of living on the streets, facing hunger, cold, and people's distrust had left deep scars on her mind and heart. Although she wanted to believe this was her chance to start over, there were moments when memories of past failures paralyzed her. Arthur, in turn, also faced his own dilemmas. The responsibility of having created the program weighed on his shoulders. He knew that many looked up to him as a leader, a philanthropist investing in a noble cause. But deep down he questioned if he was truly up to the task. As much as he wanted to help, he didn't have all the answers, and seeing Julia struggle with her own demons made him question if he was really doing enough. Julia's challenges began subtly. Small signs that the rehabilitation process wouldn't be a straight line. One day, she was excited about learning new skills and the future she was beginning to envision. But on other days, the shadows of the past came back to haunt her, bringing up the despair she had learned to carry with her over all those years. She had a constant fear of failing. The fear that, once again, all her efforts would be in vain. And this fear sometimes made her want to give up. On one of these occasions, after an intense therapy session, she disappeared. Arthur panicked. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let her be abandoned again, and now she had vanished without a trace. After hours of searching, Arthur found her in a park, sitting alone on a bench, staring off into the distance. He approached slowly, sitting beside her without saying a word. The silence between them was filled with unspoken emotions, shared frustrations and fears, but neither of them knew how to express it. Finally, it was Julia who broke the silence. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything seems so impossible. I feel like I'm destined to fail again." Arthur sighed. He understood what she was feeling because, in a way, he carried those fears too. But he knew he couldn't let her give up. "Julia," he said, looking at her seriously, "it's not about never failing. What matters is that you keep trying. We all fall, and what's important is that we get back up. I have my fears and doubts too, but we're in this together. You're not alone." She looked at him and for the first time saw Arthur's vulnerability. He, who always seemed so strong, so confident, was admitting his own weaknesses. And somehow, this made her feel that maybe, just maybe, she could keep fighting too. "But I don't know how to move forward," Julia admitted. "Every time I try, it feels like something pulls me back." Arthur took a deep breath before responding. "Life will always try to pull us back, especially when we're trying to change. But that's when we need to be the strongest. You have so much to offer, Julia. I believe in you, and I know that if you keep going, you'll overcome this." Arthur's words sparked a small flame of hope in Julia's heart. It wasn't a magical solution to her problems, but it was the encouragement she needed to take another step. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt she didn't have to face the journey alone. Arthur, in turn, felt the weight of his own words. He had promised to be there for Julia, but he knew his help couldn't just be emotional. He needed to commit body and soul to what he had started. The transformation he wanted for Julia would only be possible if he was also willing to change. So they began to work together, facing the ups and downs of the rehabilitation process. For Julia, this meant confronting her deepest traumas, accepting help from the therapists, and trusting the people around her. For Arthur, it meant learning to be patient, dealing with his own feelings of inadequacy, and above all, realizing that true transformation came from the heart, not just from the material resources he could offer. As time passed, the challenges became more intense, but signs of progress also began to emerge. Julia started to excel in the training program. Her intelligence, willpower, and desire to start over made her an exceptional student. She began to believe she could actually rebuild her life. Small victories, like completing a course or receiving praise for her performance, started to boost her self-esteem, something she had completely lost over the years. For Arthur, seeing Julia flourish brought a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. Financial success had always been his goal, but now he saw that true success was something much deeper. He felt that his life was finally aligned with something greater, something that made sense in a way money never could. However, they both knew this was just part of the journey. Julia still had a lot to face, and Arthur, despite the progress, knew he needed to keep challenging himself to ensure the program truly fulfilled its purpose. Surrounded by people who believed in her, Julia began to envision a future that once seemed impossible. But there was still a long road ahead, filled with challenges, difficult choices, and moments of doubt. Yet, with Arthur by her side, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. As Julia advanced in her personal reconstruction journey, something extraordinary began to happen. She, who had started the program as someone broken inside, now became a symbol of hope for others. Her dedication and resilience began to catch the attention of not only the professionals working with her, but also the other program participants who saw in Julia an example that change was possible, even in the most difficult situations. Arthur, on the other hand, was proud to see the growth of his childhood friend. He continued to stand by her, not as a millionaire offering help from above, but as a friend walking alongside her. Their conversations were sincere and full of mutual learning. He began to realize he was learning as much from Julia as she was from him. This made him see that true wealth was in human connection, compassion, and the positive impact he could have on others' lives. Despite all the progress, Julia still carried uncertainty within herself. As much as she was excelling in the program, there was a part of her soul that doubted her own worth. She was used to being seen as the beggar, someone society had discarded, and changing this self-image was a daily challenge. However, her desire to move forward was stronger than her fears, and each day she took another step. The real turning point, however, happened unexpectedly. One morning, as Julia was getting ready for another day of activities in the program, she was surprised by a visit from a local news team. They were interested in covering the success story of that social project, and Julia, being one of the most remarkable examples, was chosen for an interview. At first, she felt intimidated. Talking about her past in public wasn't something she wanted to do. However, with encouragement from Arthur and the team, she decided to share her journey. In the interview, Julia was honest and vulnerable. She talked about the difficulties she faced on the streets, the times she lost hope, and the unexpected encounter with Arthur that changed her life's direction. But the most touching moment was when she spoke about the credit card Arthur gave her at the beginning. "When he gave me that card," Julia said, her voice choked with emotion, "I had the chance to buy anything I wanted. I could have chosen luxury, expensive clothes, or even spent the money on frivolities. But at that moment, I realized none of that really mattered to me. All I wanted was a chance, an opportunity to start over. So I used the card only to buy a meal, because that was all I really needed at that moment. And more than that, I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't the money that would save me, but the opportunity it represented." Julia's words deeply moved the viewers. Her humility, strength, and wisdom challenged all expectations. The story went viral on social media, and suddenly, she became a symbol of hope for many people. The interview was shared thousands of times, and within days, Julia was seen as a true inspiration. Arthur was profoundly moved by the impact of Julia's story. He never expected that the simple act of giving his credit card to that woman on the street could generate such a significant change, not only in her life, but in the lives of so many others. The gesture, which had been impulsive for him, now took on proportions he could never have imagined. This unexpected turnaround also had a profound impact on Julia. For the first time, she began to believe that she could indeed break free from the identity her past had imposed on her. The support and encouraging messages she received from strangers made her see that her life had value, and that her story of overcoming could be a beacon of hope for those still struggling. With her growing notoriety, Julia was invited to participate in talks and events about overcoming adversity and resilience. At one of these events, she had the opportunity to share the stage with other survivors of extreme situations, and her testimony was met with a standing ovation. The recognition she received wasn't just an external validation, but an internal confirmation that her transformation was indeed happening. Arthur, always by her side during these moments, couldn't help but feel emotional. Reconnecting with Julia had changed his life as much as it had changed hers. He realized that, although he had started the program to help her, he was the one being transformed in the process. His view of success, once limited to the numbers and profits of his business, was now completely altered. He understood that his true wealth lay in his ability to create opportunities for others, and that the legacy he would leave in the world wouldn't be measured by his bank balance, but by the number of lives he impacted. However, with all the attention Julia was receiving, new challenges also arose. She knew that despite how far she had come, there was still much work to be done. The sudden fame brought pressures she wasn't used to dealing with. The idea of being seen as a role model of resilience was both inspiring and daunting. She knew she would still face moments of weakness and doubt, and that her internal struggle wasn't over. But this time, there was a difference. She wasn't alone anymore. With Arthur by her side, and with the support of the many people who now believed in her potential, Julia was ready to face any challenge that came her way. She had found something more valuable than any amount of money: her restored dignity, renewed confidence, and a life purpose that went beyond herself. Arthur, on the other hand, couldn't hold back the tears when he reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful encounter on the street. He thought about how a simple gesture, an impulse of generosity, had set off a chain of events that changed not just Julia's life but his own as well. He, who had started this journey looking to fill his own inner void, now felt complete in a way he never imagined. Both knew that the journey was just beginning and that many challenges were still ahead. But for the first time, they were sure they were on the right path. The impact of Julia's story didn't stop at the interview that spread across social media. As her story of overcoming continued to inspire thousands of people, Arthur and Julia realized something bigger was happening. The rehabilitation program, initially intended to help a few homeless people, quickly began attracting the attention of other business people, charitable organizations, and even the local government. Arthur, who had always been a practical businessman, found himself increasingly involved in a world completely new to him: philanthropy and social work. The training program he had created to help Julia turned into something much bigger. Companies started offering partnerships to provide training and jobs, NGOs approached with collaboration proposals, and the media continued to share the success story of the project. However, as the program grew and gained strength, Arthur and Julia knew that true success wouldn't be measured by the number of people served or the praise received, but by the lives truly transformed. The focus of the program was always to give these people more than just a roof and food. It was about restoring dignity and offering real opportunities for a fresh start. Julia, now seen as a sort of ambassador for the project, became a crucial link between new participants and the program team. She understood, better than anyone, the challenges and fears each person brought with them. With her testimony, she became a source of encouragement and inspiration for those just beginning their recovery journey. One afternoon, while in a meeting with the program team, Julia was approached by a young woman named Marisa. She was a new participant, someone who, like Julia once was at the start of her journey, full of doubts and fears. Marisa carried the lost and distrustful look of someone who had been hurt by life many times. "I heard your story," Marisa began, hesitantly, "and I wanted to know, how did you manage not to give up? I'm trying, but it seems like I'm not strong enough." Julia recognized that anguish. It was the same kind of despair she had felt countless times. With a gentle smile, she pulled up a chair next to Marisa and began to talk. "I wasn't strong all the time," Julia said honestly. "There were many moments when I wanted to give up, but what kept me going was believing that, despite everything, I deserved a new chance. And more than that, I realized I wasn't alone. I had people by my side, like Arthur, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Marisa looked at Julia, tears in her eyes. Those words seemed to have touched her deeply. "I want to believe that too," Marisa responded, her voice trembling. "But it's so hard." "I know," Julia agreed. "But believe me, every step you take, no matter how small it seems, brings you closer to what you're looking for. And you have the right to fight for it. Not for anyone else, but for yourself." This conversation with Marisa was a turning point for Julia. She began to realize that her own transformation was now helping others start their own journeys. The ripple effect that began with Arthur's simple act of giving her his credit card was expanding in ways no one could have predicted. What was once individual assistance was now a support network connecting people in their deepest struggles, offering not just resources, but also hope and meaning. Arthur, meanwhile, also felt the change within himself. He was no longer the man focused solely on numbers and material achievements. The experience of helping Julia and seeing so many other lives being touched had transformed him irreversibly. He started dedicating more time to expanding the program, using his business contacts to ensure more people had access to the opportunities he and his team were creating. The program, which initially started with just a few people, grew quickly. Arthur and his team began opening new centers in other cities, always focusing on the dignity and empowerment of homeless individuals. The project's success brought a wave of recognition, but for Arthur, the real reward was in the life stories he saw being transformed before his eyes. Meanwhile, Julia continued her personal journey. She had become a mentor to many, but knew there was still much work to do within herself. Despite her success, the scars of her past would still surface occasionally, reminding her of the battles she still needed to fight. But this time, she was ready. With the support of Arthur and the team, she knew she could keep moving forward, one day at a time. In one of Arthur's meetings with his business partners, an executive approached him and asked, "What motivated you to start this? You already had everything you needed, so why take the risk of getting into this world of social work?" Arthur, who had long prided himself on his financial achievements, paused before answering. He looked at the executive and, with a serene smile, said, "What motivated me was realizing that the true value of my life wasn't in what I possessed, but in what I could do for others." Julia showed me that. She made me realize that all the success in the world means nothing if you're not using it to improve the lives of those around you. This response perfectly summarized the transformation Arthur had experienced throughout his journey. The meeting with Julia, which initially seemed like a simple reunion with an old friend, became the catalyst for a profound and significant change in his life. At the end of that day, as he reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months, Arthur couldn't help but feel deep gratitude. He had started with the intention of helping Julia, but what happened was far beyond what he could have ever predicted. His life was transformed, his purpose redefined, and he now knew that the legacy he would leave in the world would be measured by the number of lives he helped transform. The impact Arthur and Julia created, both in their own lives and in the lives of others, marked a new phase in their personal and professional journeys. The program Arthur had started to help Julia find a new opportunity had already transformed dozens of lives, and now, with expansion to other cities, hundreds of people were being reached. But what truly made this story extraordinary was the fact that Arthur and Julia weren't just helping others. Both, in their quest for redemption and meaning, were also being deeply transformed by this experience. The redemption Julia sought was not just in overcoming the hardships of living on the streets, but in recognizing that she had found a greater purpose in her life: helping others rise again. Their story became a living example that true transformation is not just material or financial, but spiritual and emotional. The success they both sought at the beginning of the journey had been redefined, Success was now measured by the lives touched, the opportunities created, and the hope restored. One day, Julia was invited to a recognition event for community leaders who had positively impacted the lives of vulnerable individuals. She was honored as one of the key figures responsible for the expansion of Arthur's program, being presented as someone who, through her own story of overcoming, had become a pillar of hope and inspiration for many. At the event, before an audience of business people, authorities, and social activists, Julia gave a speech that moved everyone. "I am not a hero," she began, holding the microphone with trembling hands. "I'm just a woman who was lucky enough to find someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Everything I've achieved since that day was because I was given a chance. And that's what we need to remember. We all have the ability to rise again, but sometimes all we need is an opportunity." Applause filled the auditorium, and Julia, now visibly emotional, looked at Arthur, who was sitting in the front row. He watched her with pride, knowing that this moment wasn't just a recognition of the program's success, but a testament to Julia's strength of character, who, despite all adversities, had found her way. Arthur was also honored that day. When he was called to the stage, he gave a brief but powerful speech that summed up the meaning of his journey of transformation. "When I found Julia on the street, I wasn't just offering her help," Arthur said, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. "I was searching for something I had lost within myself. She taught me that no matter how much money or power we accumulate, true wealth lies in what we do for others. What started as an impulsive act of generosity turned into a lifelong mission. And I am eternally grateful for this opportunity." Arthur looked at Julia, and for a moment, they connected on a level that transcended words. It wasn't just the gratitude of someone being helped by another. It was the mutual realization that they had found in their reunion a purpose they could never have foreseen. From that moment on, Arthur decided not only to continue expanding the program, but also to ensure it would be self-sustaining, so that even when he was no longer at the helm, the legacy of the initiative would continue to transform lives. He began dedicating more time to social work than to his own businesses, delegating much of his corporate responsibilities to focus on the impact he was making in so many lives. Julia, on the other hand, became an active voice for the homeless cause. She continued participating in talks and conferences, not only sharing her own story, but also advocating for programs that offer not just charity but dignity and opportunity. Her work in Arthur's program turned her into a social reference, and her voice was heard on various platforms. However, the biggest change was in their personal lives. Julia, who once carried the weight of shame and the fear of being judged, now walked with her head held high. She knew her worth wasn't in what she owned or the hardships she faced, but in the strength of her character, her ability to overcome, and her willingness to help others. Arthur also experienced a profound change. He, who once saw success only as a result of financial achievements, now understood that true success was using his influence and wealth for the greater good. The emptiness he felt before reconnecting with Julia was filled with a sense of purpose he found by dedicating his life to something greater than himself. Their journey was not without challenges. Julia still faced moments of insecurity and fear, just as Arthur continued to struggle with balancing his financial empire and his new social responsibilities. However, what kept them strong was the certainty that they were on the right path, that their lives were finally aligned with a greater purpose. At the end of the event, as the lights dimmed and people left, Julia and Arthur remained for a moment alone in the empty auditorium. They looked at each other, and without needing words, knew that the journey they had begun together had transformed not only their own lives, but also the lives of so many others. Julia smiled at Arthur and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me." Arthur returned the smile and replied, "I'm the grateful one, Julia. You showed me what truly matters in life." From that moment on, they knew that despite all the challenges that lay ahead, they were ready to face them together. The past that once separated them was now just a distant memory. Over time, the relationship between Arthur and Julia evolved in ways neither could have predicted. What began as a reunion filled with regret and a desire for redemption turned into a deep friendship and, eventually, something much greater. The bond they had created throughout Julia's transformation journey was no longer just a partnership in the rehabilitation program or a restored friendship. Gradually, Arthur realized his feelings for her went beyond admiration and respect. Arthur began to notice that Julia was not just someone he had helped, but someone with whom he shared values, purposes, and, above all, an emotional connection that only grew stronger over time. He found himself thinking about her constantly, not just as the woman who had overcome nearly insurmountable challenges, but as someone who made him feel complete in a way he had never experienced before. The way she devoted herself to her mission, helping others with such compassion, made him admire her more every day. Julia, on the other hand, had a special affection for Arthur. He wasn't just the millionaire who had given her a chance to start over. He was a man who had shown a generous heart, willing to change not just her life, but the lives of so many others. His presence was always a source of security and comfort, but she never imagined it could mean more than that. Until one day, she started to notice her heart beating faster whenever they were together. Their love grew naturally and quietly as they continued working on the rehabilitation program and expanding the project. Their conversations, once focused on business and the lives they were transforming, began to include more personal moments, laughter, and confidences. They knew each other deeply, aware of each other's internal struggles, weaknesses, and fears, but also what motivated them and kept them moving forward. Arthur, always so practical and controlled, was the first to admit to himself that he was in love. He had never felt something like this before. A feeling so genuine, based not on superficiality but on a true connection. He knew Julia had been through a lot, and the love he felt for her could not be taken lightly. He wanted to give her not just a better life, but also his heart. And so, on a quiet evening, Arthur decided he was ready to take the most important step of his life. He planned a simple dinner, far from the glamour that usually surrounded his business life. He wanted the moment to be intimate, honest, and without distractions. Julia, suspecting nothing, arrived at the location, surprised by the cozy atmosphere and Arthur's nervous look. As they talked and shared another evening of reflections and laughter, Arthur knew the moment was approaching. His feelings were so deep and sincere that he felt he couldn't hide them any longer. In a moment of silence, he held Julia's hand and looked into her eyes like never before. "Julia, over these months, I've seen you transform. I've seen your strength, your courage, and your heart," Arthur said, his voice soft but full of emotion. "And during this time, I realized I can't imagine my life without you. You haven't just changed your life, you've changed mine." Julia was surprised, her eyes shining with a mix of emotion and surprise. Arthur continued, "I know our journey has been full of challenges, but I know it all led to this moment. I don't want to just walk by your side as a friend or a partner in our work. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, as your companion, your husband. Julia, will you marry me?" Julia was silent for a few seconds, processing what she had just heard. Tears began to form in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure joy. She had always been afraid to love again, especially after everything she had been through. But there, with Arthur, everything felt right. "Arthur," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you gave me a new chance at life. I never imagined someone could see me the way you do, much less that I could be loved so truly. Yes, I accept. I accept with all my heart." Arthur smiled, feeling indescribable joy hearing the words he had been hoping for. He gently held Julia's face, and there, under the stars, they sealed the love that had quietly grown between them. It wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new phase, one where they would continue to transform lives together, now as husband and wife. From that moment on, Arthur and Julia knew their love would be the foundation of everything they would build together, not just for themselves, but for the many lives they would continue to impact with their work. Their love was living proof that even in the most unlikely circumstances, redemption, purpose, and true love can always flourish. What did you think of Arthur and Julia's story? Leave your opinion in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? If you enjoyed it, subscribe to our channel and see you in the next video.